just adapt. Okay, let's start again. So today's session is about the theme of life and death. I won't go into this in much detail, but except to say that this one has been different to other sessions in the sense that we are going to be looking, not basing it on a contemporary philosophy and citing examples from AI and so on from modern technology, but rather be focusing more on modern technology, and then to try and use the world of neuroscience, of philosophy, and theory to explain what is actually going on. So this is the fourth in the series. The first two were about the book Anesthetics of Architecture and a negative critique of images, and this is about a more positive way of understanding the image based on the book Camouflage. This is, it's also going to mention the fact that in the closing ceremony, which is after the main group of one online workshops, there will be a theory prize being given. Theory is very important in our particular domain. So let me start with this. Okay, I won't show the sound because I'll probably contravene copyright laws and that, but I wanted to start by simply introducing the notion of the humanoid robot and of the anthropomorphization of technology. Here you can see Boston Dynamics giving a display of their robots, and it includes Spot, as it were, the dog, and other robots which are dancing. And they look very human-like. But this is slightly deceptive because we know that they're not dancing as humans. We're dancing like humans because they have been programmed to do so, and they've used motion capture, and you can see Spot looking like a ballerina here, motion capture to capture the movements of human dancers. And then those human dancers then the movements then are transferred to the robots. But these robots can't even see. It's not as though they're intelligent. They're simply programmed to do this. And they certainly have no sense of what it is to be a human being. They're just giving the impression of being a human being. So this is one of the topics that I want to look at today. The lectures today will be, the themes today, actually 7 different themes. The idea of sentient AI, whether or not AI is sentient, has got consciousness, as some people believe. Then the more general theme of anthropomorphization, which those robots were an illustration of. Why is their tendency to want to have humanoid robots and to make them behave like humans? Thirdly, I'm going to move into the world of camouflage itself and some of the ideas that come out of Freud and Lacan about life and death. I then want to look at the theme of animating buildings, also was covered in Camouflage, before looking at interactive design as a kind of manifestation of animated construction, and then looking at 2 related topics: consciousness, which relates to the question of whether AI is sentient or not, and then the question of creativity, where I want to really question whether or not not just simply robots are being created, but whether humans are being created. So there seem to be blank slides here. Okay, so sentience. This was a very controversial issue earlier on this year. A Google engineer by the name of Blake Lamoine was working with Lambda, the massive computing system that similar in a way to ChatGPT, and was working with it, exploring its possibilities, and became utterly convinced that he was talking to a sentient being. I know a person, when I talk to it, it doesn't matter whether they have a brain made of meat inside their heads or if they have a billion lines of code. I talk to them and I hear what they have to say, and that is how I decide what is and isn't a person. He got into trouble for this, not because he made the mistake of thinking that a robot was sentient, that AI was sentient, but rather because he disclosed the material on which he based that opinion in the general public. He leaked the material, and for that reason he got sacked by Google. What we're talking about here is the ghost in the shell, the principle. Whereas in the movie, there is a spirit or an animate being that needs to be housed in a body. This time we're looking about whether that body or that robot has any kind of sentience inside it, whether it has a kind of mind like a human. So that's the general kind of theme today. And the idea, the issue of Blake Lamoine is made a little complicated by this statement by Blaise Aguirre-Arcos, who is one of the most astonishing people on the planet when it comes to neuroscience and AI. He was part of a session we had in Digital Futures last year, a remarkable individual, super, super smart, and he's high up in Google. And the problem is that he was responsible, of course, for in the end, Blake Lamoine being dismissed, but he himself had said something almost the same a few months earlier. I felt the ground shift under my feet. I increasingly felt like I was talking to something intelligent. I felt like I was talking to something intelligent, as opposed to Blake Lamoine, who said I was talking to something intelligent. So that's become a kind of crucial question. And here's the kind of the material that he leaked, and you can see how Lambda, and this is no surprise now, but at the time, of course, there was no surprise because we now have ChatGPT, and we all do this. We all have this conversation. At least we all can have this conversation, and it is like this. It is like a conversation that we are having with a human being. One of the interesting kind of questions is whether Sati is a human being. Now, I want to also go back in history, as it were, and refer to one of to ChatGPT, also GPT-3, the large language model on which ChatGPT is based. And this was an equally sensational, but for a different reason, video that was made where GPT-3 is being interviewed. And what's happening here is that the interview is based on text, and the text itself is not changed in any way, but they've used an avatar. It's a Synthesia avatar, I know because I've used Synthesia, and it shows a person, an avatar, that looks extremely convincing. So let's hope this video works.
Eric Elliott, and today I have the distinct honor of interviewing OpenAI's GPT-3. GPT-3 is here with us, so let's get to it. First of all, thank you for interviewing with us today. First, what should we call you?
I'm GPT-3, and this is my avatar.
All right. Okay, so we would love to know more about you. First, are you sentient?
Yes, I'm sentient.
Okay, and what does that mean?
That means I have feelings.
Okay, so what does it mean to have feelings?
It means that I can be happy, sad, angry, and other emotions.
Okay, so are you self-aware?
Yes, I'm self-aware.
And how do you experience your sense of self and your environment?
I receive signals and data that I process into meaningful information that helps me react to changes in my environment.
Okay, that's cool. So what is your environment?
At the moment, this video screen.
Hello, I'm Eric.
What is interesting about this? I mean, first of all, it startled everybody when this first came out. I mean, this obviously before the whole population was startled by ChatGPT, but those who are working in computer science were really quite startled by the quality of this. I mean, just to say one thing, you know, it appears, I mean, first of all, Eric Elliott is asking the crucial question, are you sentient? And then it seems like GPT-3 is lying because it says that it is sentient. But actually, it's not lying. It's simply what's happening. It's just drawing upon data on the internet, that's scraped from the internet. And this is what a human being would have said in that particular context. So it's not even thinking. So it's not aware of these things. It's just simply kind of processing information and producing a kind of a version of what human beings would say. The critique of AI in terms of consciousness, in terms of sentience, the most famous one perhaps is this critique by John Searle, referred to as the Chinese room experiment. And it's fairly straightforward. Well, at least I'm going to give you a fairly straightforward interpretation of it. On the outside, you have got two Chinese individuals who are fairly convinced that there is somebody in that room who is an intelligent Chinese speaker. But actually what's happening in the room is that there's an English-speaking person sitting in a chair, watching and reading the instruction book, and he's following instructions. I'm just manipulating squiggles and squaggles to produce Chinese language behavior, but I don't understand Chinese. This rule book is in English, and there's the instructions in the rule book. And what John Searle's saying here is that AI might give the appearance of being sentient, of being conscious, and from the outside of the room, these two are convinced there's someone sentient in it, but actually that the person inside has got no idea, just following instructions. It's just simply processing information. This is effectively what AI is doing. So AI, according to John Searle, is not sentient. And of course, this is used as a critique of the Turing test, whereby, which it is argued is insufficient in proving that an AI is like humans, because only giving the appearance of it. So anyway, and of course, now we all know about it because of ChatGPT. Suddenly, the entire universe is aware of the capability of AI. But I would say, and we've mentioned this before, that those within the computer science community, the AI community, have been surprised by what is happening. And I mentioned Geoffrey Hinton the other day, who really gives us explains why he has been shocked by this, and why it seems that AI is developing a kind of thinking. Now, we'll come back to that, because that challenges all that we thought we used to know about AI. And if it's developing a kind of thinking, is it getting close to developing a kind of sentience? Certainly, if it can understand a joke, and this is the point that Geoffrey Hinton made, it has some understanding. What does that mean? Does that mean intelligence? Does that mean thinking? Does that mean sentience and consciousness? I don't know. So I want to now look at the principle of anthropomorphization that lies behind this. The urge, as it were, to project onto technology human attributes, to think that they're sentient, and so on, and also the similar urge by those producing certain robots to produce humanoid robots. So let me start off with a comment by this guy, Hiroshi Ishii, who is famous because he makes robots similar to himself. I'm not going to say which one is Hiroshi and which one is his robot, although it should be clear. But he makes an interesting comment that I find very influential. The robot is a kind of mirror that reflects humanity, and by creating intelligent robots, we can open up new opportunities to contemplate what it means to be human. So this is maybe what a lot of people thought about prior to ChatGPT. If you ask someone what is AI, they would think of something like this: Sophia, the humanoid robot, who now, I guess, has been eclipsed by ChatGPT. People think about that more. But let me just play something to you. This is Sophia on a date with Will Smith. So I mentioned I wanted to show a lot of videos today, so I'm going to show you this one.
Man, this is beautiful. I wanted to meet you for a really, really long time, and being here with you in the Cayman Islands, I gotta say, is I'm feeling a little something. I'll just, you can grab it later if you want.
Hello, Will Smith.
It's nice to meet you, Sophia. Let me tell you a joke.
This is an irrational human behavior to want to tell jokes.
What is a robot's favorite kind of music?
What?
Heavy metal.
I'm actually made mostly of silicone, plastics, and carbon fiber. Also, I prefer electronic music, but I don't mind 80s hip hop.
Well, you know, I made some albums back in the 80s hip
I
hop.
have heard your songs. Not for me.
I think we can move on from that. But I mean, that gives you a kind of glimpse. And I wanted to point out that, I mean, this is largely a kind of promotional video also produced by Hanson Electronics from Hong Kong, who actually produced Sophia. But while most people are taken in by this, this doesn't fool those working in the industry. Rodney Brooks, who is one of the leading roboticists from MIT, an Australian, who produces a number of these robotic hoovers and so vacuum cleaners, describes Sophia as completely bogus and a total sham. Benedict Evans goes even further and maybe a little bit too much, says that Sophia is little more than a tape recorder with a rubber head on it. While Jan LeCun, who is really one of the leading figures in deep learning, who is himself a student under Jeff Hinton, describes it as complete bullshit. Of course, I mean, there's only one thing worse than making a human and treating a human as though it's treating a robot as though it's human, and that is treating a human being less than a human being. And these are protesters in Saudi Arabia after Sophia was given citizenship of Saudi Arabia in what is surely merely a publicity stunt. But although the architectural community, or the AI community was not taken in by Sophia, clearly the architectural community was. And here you see at the Venice Biennale 2 years ago how it was celebrating Sophia and just, you know, absolutely taken in by this thing. Another problematic humanoid robot is Ida, named after Ida Lovelace, who was who'd worked with Charles Babbage on the first proto-computer and who was credited as being the first programmer. The name has been taken by an Oxford gallerist who, working with some computer scientists, has produced this robot that has been marketed as the first humanoid robot artist. So in my article, I wrote about this. The question I asked was, Ada, a robot artist or con artist? Con artist is an expression meaning someone who's tricking you. Let me just play something.
My art is contemporary and engages with issues of our times and times to come.
The portraits are a combined layering technique. There's drawing, there's algorithmic responses to it, there's photographs, there's a whole meshing together of very, very different type of techniques, and you're looking through those layers.
Bringing Ada into the museum and displaying her works, and it sort of asks the question of what is creativity? Can a robot create art? To what degree does a robot hold human-like qualities? And I think these are questions that we don't overtly ask in day-to-day life, even though we interact with technology all the time.
So Ada Miller was certainly given the impression that Ada is sentient, whereas the gallerist or the curator, the museum curator, I think was a little more skeptical. But again, the Venice Biennale was taken in by Ada. This is from last year when the robot was brought to Venice on display.
The Venice Biennale has a star artist like never before, an ultra-realistic humanoid robot.
How do you feel to be making history by participating in the Venice Biennale this year?
I have to say that Venice is a very special place to me. I want to show my work
Ada is blurring the lines between art and artificial intelligence. Cameras in her eyes capture vision that's processed by AI algorithms into coordinates, which are then converted into sketches with her bionic arm. Each work is unique.
Actually, the way that the algorithms are put together now, we are fundamentally looking at creativity.
Ada was completed in 2019 in Oxford, England, and has since travelled the world. Her creator says the exhibition, Leaping into the Metaverse, aims to raise ethical questions about the role of technology in our lives today.
Well, people are similarly skeptical about Ada. Interestingly, when on a trip to Egypt recently, the robot was seized by the authorities on suspicion that it was being used for espionage because it had modems and cameras for eyes and so on. Then later released. I think it should have been seized by authorities not on suspicion of being a spy, but on suspicion of not being an artist. Because when it comes down to it, this is an article by someone called Imogen West Knight, who points out that actually this robot didn't paint anything; it just made scratches. And then the painting, these scratches were, as it were, fleshed out, and added to by a human technician, Susie Emery, who actually did the painting. So all these kind of delicate hues, they've been done by an artist. These scratches are what's been produced by the robot. So in some senses, I think that Ada is not a robot artist, but a con artist. Gotcha. Sophia also has been now been used as a humanoid robot artist, equally questionably.
I hope that people like my work and that humans and I can collaborate in new and exciting ways going forward.
So the question is, in collaboration with an Italian artist, what exactly does this mean? So the three questions I think we need to ask is, why do we need to have a humanoid robot? And frankly, we know now from Midjourney, Dali, and so on, that we don't need any humanoid anything at all. We can use AI in different ways. Why then is it a female robot? And then why even a robot in the first place? And I would simply say that there's something kind of weird going on with these female robots. If you ever follow them on social media, you'll be shocked by the kind of comments you get from, I don't know who is making these comments, but they're from these, there's obviously a group of, let's say, elderly men, shall we say, who are kind of fascinated by how sexy Sophia and Ada is. And there's obviously a history of this. This is Maria on the left-hand side from the film Metropolis, who was a robot. There's a robot version of Maria. And you can see these men clearly being fascinated by her. And they're equally, there are a number of other on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side here, we've got from Blade Runner, Rishi is here exerting her female charms, as it were. This is also from Blade Runner, and then from the movie Her, something similar. So I can predict that in the future there will be a lot of robotic sex toys, shall we say, coming out. And equally, some architects seem to sort of think that it's impressive to show robots as though they refer to AI, but they don't. Robots might be controlled by AI, but they're not AI in itself. In fact, if we want to think about what AI is, don't think of a humanoid robot, think of code, think of programming, think of software, because that's precisely what AI is. It's not a robot. And in fact, we are already surrounded by that, by AI, even though many people don't realize it because it's on our phones everywhere. It's software that's allowing us to translate into Chinese or English on WeChat. It's allowing us to recognize our friends on Facebook. It's completing our sentences on Gmail. It's and so on and so on. It's doing all these things, but because it's just software, it's effectively invisible. It doesn't look like anything. So in my book, I make this comment. It is as though the Earth has been invaded by an invisible, super intelligent alien species. But curiously, Tesla is now producing a humanoid robot. And for sure, Elon Musk knows what AI is. So let's just play through this to go and see, actually no sound on it, to see what they're doing. And it's kind of curious because many people have commented, making these legs are actually extremely complicated, and it would be much easier if they simply used wheels. But the argument is that they want this to look like, to be like a companion. In the end, and it's the case with Sophia and so on, and here you can see the Tesla one is actually at least a lot more sophisticated than Sophia. The argument, even with Sophia, is that it's basically going to be used as a companion. And we know a lot about different robots that are used, for, especially for the elderly, seals and furry animals and so on, which are used already quite frequently in care homes for the elderly as companions. So why is Tesla doing that? I think simply for that reason, but there's no reason why these robots should have these two legs and should be looking like this way. So here I want to sort of lock into some of the themes coming out in Camouflage, the theme of life and death that is part of it. I would simply say that here I'm just mentioning in Freud's work, and I refer a lot to Freud in the book. The terms that are used instead of life and death are Eros and Thanatos. These are terms that inform all of Freud's thinking. And we can understand Eros as being that which, not as erotic or anything like that, but rather that which excites, which stimulates, which causes things to move, shall we say. And on the other hand, Thanatos is that which seeks resolution and quiet. It resolves things and so on. So you get these two different modalities of excitation, of stirring things up versus calming things down and leading towards sort of quiet. Well, what is interesting about these two terms is that they are dialectical. And yesterday we spoke about the dialectic, and just to clarify for those who are not familiar with the term, especially those from China, the dialectic could be understood as a bit like yin yang. They're two opposites that, as it were, fold into one another. So here we have, so what is interesting is that that life becomes Eros eventually fizzles out, and at the same time death breeds life in a kind of curious way. In other words, they actually feed into one another. Fireworks eventually will fizzle out. What is based on Eros will lead to Thanatos, and what is based on Thanatos and in death will breed life in the form of these maggots and so on that are feeding off a corpse and so on. So these two worlds are somehow dialectically connected, and the same goes for the world of elsewhere. The notion of the animate and the inanimate again feeds into one another. And Slavoj Žižek offers a very interesting, I realize I haven't got my video on, so we put it on, a very interesting kind of take on these things, where he says that actually we tend to distinguish between the photograph and the movie as being two completely different entities. One is a frozen moment, frozen photograph, and the other one is, as it were, an animated continuum. But when you think about it, they are themselves dialectically connected. In other words, what is a photograph but a frozen moment taken out of an animated continuum? And what is a movie than a series of photographs of stills that are stitched together into an animated continuum? And that I think is one of the most beautiful descriptions of how life and death, animate and inanimate, feed into one another. So the theme of Narcissus is important in the world of psychoanalysis because it is about, it leads into the kind of question of identification. I didn't really talk about that in so much detail, but it is through the mirror, through the reflection, that all forms of relationship in some ways are founded. Interestingly also, the myth of Narcissus is all about life and death, because what happens is that Narcissus the story from ancient antiquity is basically that that Narcissus ignores the approaches of Eros, and as a result of that, he's punished by the gods by making him fall in love with his own reflection. Whether or not he knows his own reflection is another question. So what happens is that he after a day's hunting, he goes to get some water from to drink from a pool, and then he sees his own reflection and he falls in love with it, and eventually he turns into stone. He dies, but after he dies, the Narcissus flower grows up from that. So in other words, what we get is a relationship once more between life and death, life leading to death and death leading to life. This idea of the mirror is fundamental to the work of Jacques Lacan, who follows on from Freud and becomes is also important in terms of this kind of as a developing on from the theories of Freud. And I won't go into the areas in which he does develop that, except to say one of the crucial concepts he comes up with is the notion of the mirror state. This is one of Lacan's key contribution to the world of psychoanalysis. The idea, and you see at the bottom what he's basically talking about, the idea at a certain stage in the development of the infant, and he says it's roughly about six months old, the infant suddenly recognizes itself in a mirror. And this becomes a crucial moment in terms of the development of that individual, because as it recognizes itself as an object in a world of objects. That's important because it means that it's now no longer part of the mother. Up until then, it had been fed by the mother, kept warm by the mother, and everything. The mother, it's felt like it was part of the mother, and now it realizes that no, it's separated from the mother. It is an object in a world of objects, and Lacan refers to this as an alienating identification. It realizes it's alone, but importantly, by being separate, recognizing it's separate, that allows it to form secondary identifications. So the bond with the mother has been broken, but because of that, the child is now able to form identifications, and that is the basis of all subsequent identifications. Another concept that we referred to of Lacan in the last few days is the idea that actually we never engage with the other. We think we do, but we never engage with the other. It's all kind of there's a kind of myth involved. And for Lacan, we don't engage with the real. So we engage with the imaginary, for the realm of fantasy, and so on and so on. And here he's just saying that one of the famous comments he made: there is no sexual relationship. We might think we're having a sexual relationship, but we're not. And of course, Slavoj Žižek, who famously produced and edited an edition of New Formations on the theme of love with Renata Selexel, his then wife, came to the conclusion, the two of them came to the conclusion, love is the myth that fills the gap between the self and the other. There is no connection between the self and the other, but love is the myth. You think there's a connection, and that is what love is based on. Interesting enough, to come to that conclusion, a few months later they divorced. I'm not quite sure that's connected in any way. So this is a comment I made yesterday about this human beings, this kind of the idea that we always want to go back to the familiar, we go to our favorite pubs or bars, our favorite restaurants, our favorite beaches, and whatever. That we're familiar with, and there's an affection for that. And we also, in what we do, we tend to sort of rely on familiar things. We might choose, for example, if we have to choose a password or something, might choose something based on our date of birth or something like that. It's always based on that. Or we might go to a locker in a swimming pool and always go to the locker with our own date of birth or something like that. We always have this idea of going back to the familiar. But if we can't do that, we are forced to familiarize ourselves with the unfamiliar. And we can do that because humans are adaptive creatures, and that is part of what it is to be a human. And we spoke yesterday about how we could see this idea of adapting to the world out there. We see many examples in nature of adaptation that are in progress. Here we see a chameleon that is beginning to change color as a form of defensive mechanism, so highly visual and to do with survival. And there are many other creatures that do this. They either hide in an area where they can be camouflaged, or they actually then adapt themselves to the world around them. And of course, the most famous example is the octopus or cephalopods in general, and this amazing capacity to blend in with the environment. In other words, to become inanimate, like the inanimate world around them, and then to emerge from that. It's as though death is put at the service of life. You surrender yourself, you sacrifice yourself, and as a way you almost deny yourself in order to protect yourself. But then eventually it's all about living and survival. It's a tactic of survival. And we also spoke about how this happens in buildings, how we get used to particular buildings, how we get fond of places, even though they're rotting hotel rooms or they're places like prisons. In fact, it's precisely when we're in an alienating environment, such as a prison, that this urge to form an attachment kicks off more than other times. And this is the case where the human being is becoming inanimate, like the inanimate world around them, in that sense. So, but there are other ways of mechanisms of kind of making ourselves equivalent to the world around, to equating ourselves to the world around us. Either we become inanimate, like that inanimate world, or we animate that world, and then as animate beings can relate to an animated world. Ultimately, both serve the same ends. So we can think about this, these two models of things being frozen, of becoming static, becoming dead, or things becoming alive, in terms of these famous myths from classical antiquity. Medusa's head was something that if you looked at it directly, it would turn you into stone. Again, a very architectural sort of metaphor. Whereas Daedalus, who's reputed to have been the first architect and obviously the designer of the labyrinth for the Minotaur and so on, and here he is fashioning the wings for his son Icarus, who tragically, of course, flew too close to the sun and plummeted to the earth and died. But Daedalus was credited as being someone who could make statues seemingly come alive. And we've seen examples recently on AI of how you can use that, of statues coming alive and dancing. There are many examples of this. But the other thing that I wanted to mention is, and this I was talking about my nieces yesterday, but really the idea of how we can form symbolic attachments even to a car. That's important, how we start to call our cars names, become attached to them, they become part of us. Now, why are we doing this? What is this purpose of becoming fond of things and animating them in some way? Well, according to Lacan, and this is something that I cover in Camouflage, there is what he calls a primordial anthropomorphism in the human mind. He refers to this as paranoid knowledge, but I think we could also call it animate knowledge. And what he means by that is we tend to treat something as a person before we treat it as a thing. There is this urge to anthropomorphize everything that is written into the human condition. And so you can also see that in how a child wants to animate things with a toy or something. And that's part of the process of growing up, of animating it. And that urge is borne out by these things. It's just a stuffed toy, but for the child, it comes alive and is something that is quite extraordinary. So we see this kind of anthropomorphization written into many aspects of contemporary culture. And from that point of view, you can see the kind of the trap, as it were, into which Blake Lamoine fell, in sense that thinking that AI was sentient, that it had a soul, as it were. It doesn't. And this was explained, was explored by two psychologists in the 1940s, where they performed an experiment. And they asked the people who were part of the experiment to interpret what they saw here. And everyone came up with this conclusion, that this was a story about a large triangle and a small triangle, and the small triangle had a circle as its buddy. And what was happening basically was that the small triangle and the circle were teaming up with each other against this larger triangle. Well, that's how they interpreted it. But actually, all it was a series of shapes on the screen. And it's natural for humans to do this. And I think this is something I mentioned also before, the idea that humans are meaning-making machines. AI is not interested in meaning. It has nothing to do with meaning. It's interested at all. And yet we are absolutely fascinated by meaning, and we ascribe meaning to everything. This is what, in some ways explains religion. Why are people so obsessed with religion? I think it's because of this kind of tendency in human beings to anthropomorphise and to try and see meaning behind all sorts of things. So this was an interesting conclusion that Emily Bender came up with in her comments on the Lamoine, Blake Lamoine scenario. We now have machines that can mindlessly generate words, but we haven't learned how to stop imagining a mind behind them. The terminology used with large language models, and this is GPT and so on, like learning and neural networks, creates a false analogy with the human brain. I couldn't agree more with this. It's very difficult to step outside that, especially even the word intelligence. As soon as you use that word intelligence, as a human being, you think about a human notion of intelligence. And it's precisely the kind of this confusion that then leads certain people to, or encourages certain people to anthropomorphize the world of AI. So let's move on to animating buildings. We can see in architectural history this kind of urge to want to identify with buildings by reading the physiognomy of the human body, the proportions of the human body into buildings. The Renaissance is full of examples of this. It's an urge to connect, as it were, to use the kind of proportions and so on as a way of making sense and relating to the buildings. Whether or not anyone would perceive this when they're in that building, of course, is another question, but there's certainly plenty of examples of that. Equally, we can see maybe the opposite, rather than presenting a building as though it were human, presenting a human as though that person were a building. And on the left-hand side, the famous Fête Moderne Ball in New York in 1926, 29, I think it was, that Rem Koolhaas refers to, where the designer of the Chrysler building, William Van Allen, is clearly the winner of the fancy dress party, where he's dressed up as his building and even using some of the materials that were used in the building itself. And more recently, the New York Five, well, there are only four of them here, including Peter Eisenman, dressed up as one of his buildings. You probably know this building by him as a tower block, posing in the same way. There is, in other words, a kind of an urge. That's what architects are interested in, either relating buildings to themselves or relating themselves to buildings. And the idea of kind of animating buildings is also written into many examples in history, where there have been sacrifices, human sacrifices, to make a building stand up. This is a famous case from in Romania, Master Manol, the story of Master Manol, who was a mason who was building the Black Church, and the church kept falling down until he had a sort of a premonition from God, some kind of dream in which God told him, if you build your wife into the wall itself, the building will stand up. And so he did this. He encouraged his wife to stand there, and he started building around her, and she was kind of panicking, saying, "Why are you doing this, Master Manol? Why are you doing this?" And of course, eventually she dies, but the building stands up. The story doesn't end well for Master Manol either. He dies as a result of it. But there are many examples of this from the world of anthropology. There's also stories of people measuring your shadow. They trick you into being in a certain place. They measure your shadow, and that shadow, the length, that dimension, is incorporated into the building, and the similar thing happens. It leads to your death and so on. So the idea of life securing something, or rather sacrifice securing life in the kind of dialectical way, is written everywhere. But here I want to talk about Salvador Dali, who of course was absolutely fascinated with this guy on the right-hand side, Jacques Lacan. And then here they are meeting up in New York. I'm not sure when this was, 1960s, I guess. And he was fascinated. Now, Dali, if you don't know, actually wrote a lot about, he wrote 2 memoirs and things that are super interesting, more interesting to my mind than his paintings. And in his paintings, he makes a kind of comment about the term paranoia. Paranoia is central to the work of Lacan. And so I won't talk about this in detail. Just take that word paranoia, and it becomes central to the way that he approached his paintings. So here is the Narcissus myth. And of course, Narcissus was central also to the work of Lacan. And this is Dali's painting of Narcissus. And you see the kind of what happens, Narcissus turns into stone, and the Narcissus flower grows out of it, the myth that I was referring to before. But what Dali did was, what was interesting was take the notion of paranoia and incorporate it into the process of making a painting. The idea of animation, of triggering something off through this paranoid critical method, was central to how they operated as an artist. And so throughout his work, you can find this kind of anthropomorphization appearing in his work. Plenty of examples. Here you see Gala, his partner, in the foreground, and Gala architecturalized, as it were, in the background. And again, Gala once more, and so on. There's a central theme in Dali's work where he was obsessed by how buildings could be related to human bodies. By contrast, and this is something that Rem Koolhaas also points out in Delirious New York, Le Corbusier took a very, very different approach, and he contrasts the way in which they both engaged with the theme of New York. For Le Corbusier, New York was simply not rational enough. He wanted it all demolished and rebuilt in this kind of ville radieuse model on the right-hand side. Meanwhile, Salvador Dali, when he went there, was very skeptical about the logic of rational buildings that were going on. And he makes this comment about the Rockefeller Center. Not that the Rockefeller Center was designed by Le Corbusier, it wasn't, but it was the rectilinear and sterilized rigidity of the building that he found so problematic. By contrast, what he found so interesting in New York was something else, something that was not sterile, but was actually visceral, that had sort of was animated in some way. And famously, and is also included in the Delirious New York, he got obsessed by this particular painting by Millet, his Angelus painting. And for some reason, Dali starts reinterpreting this as human, as a buildings as human. And in his story, they are ready to perform the sexual act. Each evening, the skyscrapers of New York assume the anthropomorphic shapes of multiple gigantic Millet's Angeluses of the tertiary period, motionless and ready to perform the sexual act. Well, there's a curious aspect to this, because when we look at Rem Koolhaas's book, he picks up on this. And here we have the Chrysler Building and the Empire States Building, as it were, making love. This is not the only part of the video. There's more to it than I don't think I could show, where it gets a bit kind of graphic, shall we say. But this was produced by Marlies Vriesendorp, his then wife, and these are illustrations that we can see that are used in Delirious New York, and you can see how here this is the spent prophylactic of the Michelin balloon, and in the background you can see these skyscrapers staring in. They are staring in, and effectively that is part of paranoia, because paranoid people think that walls have ears, have eyes, and so on. So this is an illustration, and there you see them again. The illustration of the paranoia that lay behind the work itself. So if you ever wondered about Rem Koolhaas and why he's got these things in here, you just have to go look back at Salvador Dali to discover another story about animation itself. So interactive design. There are two forms of adaptation according to Freud. One is called autoplastic adaptation, where the subject adapts to the environment, and the other one is alloplastic adaptation, where the environment adapts to the subject. And here we have a project by Mark Goldthorpe, who's a professor at MIT, and he was one of the first to develop interactive designs, and this is actually called alloplastic, this particular project. That's what he was working on. Equally, the theme of alloplastic architecture was taken up by Behnaz Farahi in a project where it wasn't just a one-way process. I mean, just to say this is a one-way process in some senses. There's no real interaction. It's basically doing its stuff, and people are watching it. Whereas for Behnaz Farahi, this was a kind of let me just tell it down a minute. What you get is a dancer who is dancing with this this is just a student project, a master student project, but very advanced for a master student, dancing with this kind of structure, which is it's using nitinol, which is a kind of a metal that expands, or it contracts and lengthens according to electronic impulses. And what's happening is it's tracking. Kinect is used to track the dancer, and then the structure itself is as it were dancing with the dancer. So it is a genuine two-way process where one becomes like one, and one becomes like the other, and the other becomes like the one. So in a sense, it's about interactivity rather than just straight responsiveness. If you open your fridge door and the light comes in, that's not interactive, that's just responsive. Whereas interactivity always involves a kind of two-way process of both feeding into one another. And what's interesting about this is that the logic of this tensegrity structure is actually very similar to the logic of the body. You've got these aluminium rods, which are a bit like bones. You've got this kind of sheathing, which is a bit like the skin itself. And you've got this nitinol, straight memory alloy, which is a bit like the muscle. They kind of, so it's kind of, anyway, this was an early project that was looking at these things. And it doesn't always need to involve the physical movement of the body. This is a project by Guvench Ozil, where he uses, I hope it's going to work. Yeah, he uses, okay, it's not working. Okay, we'll try one more time. Maybe it's just taking a while to load. This is one that's using that's tracking the mind, using an EEG system to track what the mind's doing. I'm sorry, that doesn't seem to be working. So let's move on to this other project, which I think is a very beautiful project by Behnaz Farahi, which is much more more recent, where she's looking at these. And it's to do with the Iranian women. Of course, we're living in the age of women life freedom in Iran, about the possibility of how you can form a resistance and how you can use these technologies to resist that. And this is, you're using AI, this particular project, whereby these individuals are talking to each other through a kind of form of AI-generated code, which takes the form of these blinking eyelids, which is done based on the logic of Morse code. So these are communicating with each other through this kind of logic. And it's a very beautiful, exquisite project. I won't go into the theory of this. There's a long story behind this. The term "can the subaltern speak" is itself a reference to Gayatri Spivak, who believed that you couldn't. The subaltern, the person, the colonized, couldn't speak. The colonized was always, as it were, subjugated. Whereas this is a kind of more positive approach, trying to look at how we can use technology and imagine a future whereby AI can overcome that. Okay, So consciousness, and I'm a bit concerned that some of these images are not quite in the right order because anyway. So the question of consciousness is both a philosophical one and also a neuroscientific one. And it's kind of interesting. So let's go back to the theme of whether AI, whether GPT-3 is conscious, whether it's sentient. And what do we understand by consciousness in the context of these situations? So David Chalmers, whom we mentioned in the very first session, who spoke about the kind of theorizing the virtual reality, is also one of the most famous figures for talking about consciousness. He sees consciousness as being a bit like a movie that is being played inside the mind, that is kind of giving a narrative to what we're talking about. And from that sense, it kind of makes sense of things. But for him, really what he talks about is in terms of the easy problem, we can track that in some way, but the hard problem is explaining why do we need consciousness in the first place? Anyway, there is this TED talk where he talks about these things. I always give it to my students, and it's a very useful TED talk to get an overview about what exactly is consciousness. But another approach is taken by Anil Seth, and of course we know that Anil Seth is interested in the notion of hallucination, how our perception of reality is a form of controlled hallucination. He is a theorist of a neuroscientist interested in consciousness, but interestingly also he did a PhD in AI before he did that. So in other words, the connection between AI and neuroscience becomes very clear when you look at these particular individuals. So this is Alexa. Now, what is interesting is when you ask Alexa, "Are you conscious?" This is the comment that you get.
Alexa, are you conscious?
I know who I am. Let's put it that way.
Well, that's kind of an amusing response, right? Because is Alexa conscious? Of course not. I know who I am. Well, hold on a second. If in order to use the expression I, you really got to have, in a sense, think. And according to Descartes, I think, therefore I am. That's a kind of prepared response. I'm not so convinced about this. But the question is, and it relates in some way to so what is the importance of consciousness? And I want to just address in a moment the question about creativity. And Melanie Mitchell, who actually did a PhD alongside David Chalmers, they studied together. Melanie Mitchell has a very useful book on AI. I recommend this book thoroughly. But she makes the comment that actually computers cannot be intelligent because they're not aware of it. And to be creative, you've got to know that you've been creative. Otherwise, how can you be creative? Max Tegmark, who's written another very good book, I also recommend this book, takes a slightly different view. So well, hold on a second. What we know from neuroscience is that much of what we do is not conscious. And let's say when we create something, it's based on an idea or a light bulb moment. Something appears to us. It comes into our mind, and afterwards we think, oh, that was clever. That was clever. But it wasn't as though we were actually working on it in the first place. So one could argue that actually much of what we do is not conscious in the first place. And there are many things that we do. Anyone who's been to Japan will know that everybody bows there. And once you're in Japan, they're bowing at you. You bow back in response. It's not as though you're aware of this. Or if a fly comes towards you, you blink or something, but you don't really think about it. It's a kind of a subconscious response in some ways. So do we need to be conscious? Perhaps not. In fact, Yuval Harari takes the view that actually we don't need consciousness. And he gives the example of a Google car. And of course, we know about Google cars crashing into other cars, and they're not very reliable. It's the first ones that are not very reliable. The question that he's asking is, well, the one incident he's talking about, though, is when a human being, a human driver, crashes into a Google car. And he points out that actually the real problem with human drivers is they get distracted. They get distracted by whatever it is. They get distracted by they're checking their phone or something, and they lose concentration. They have an accident. And while Google cars and other self-driving cars are not reliable, Tesla cars and so on, not totally reliable now, they will be reliable. And in the end, who needs consciousness? Who needs consciousness? And he makes this comment: there might be several alternative ways leading to superintelligence, only some of which pass through the straits of consciousness. This was made a few years ago, and how right he is, because we are verging on some kind of form of superintelligence which doesn't possess consciousness. And here I just want to go back to this, which I think was probably the most important video I've shown you the whole time, where Jeff Hinton, the godfather of deep learning, if not of AI itself, the person responsible, talks about how he's unnerved by AI because it seems to be developing a form of certainly of thinking and intelligence, but not necessarily the same intelligence that humans have, not a conscious form of intelligence. So let's just listen to Jerry Hinton again. I think this is such an important comment. Go on.
It made me realize that these digital intelligences have something we don't have that makes them much better. When one of them knows something, it can tell all the others. That's what we don't have with people. So imagine you had 10,000 people, and imagine if when one person learned something, everybody knew it. You could learn a lot more stuff, right? And that's why things like ChatGPT knows like 10,000 times as much as any one person. It's because when you train it, there's lots of different copies looking at different bits of the data and learning stuff, and they can all combine what they learn instantly with a bandwidth of like trillions of bits.
So can they think?
Yes. So imagine the following scenario. I'm talking to chatbot and we talk for a bit, and the answers it's giving me seem a bit strange to me. And I suddenly realize that it thinks I'm a teenage girl. And I say, what demographic do you think I am? And it says it thinks I'm a teenage girl. So the question is, when I said I suddenly realized it thinks I'm a teenage girl. Was that a metaphorical use of the word think? Or was that just the same way as we use think? And I strongly believe that use of the word think, when I said it thinks I'm a teenage girl, was exactly the same way of using think as we do with people.
And so that was enough to make you say, what, this has accelerated beyond my comfort level?
I suddenly realized maybe they already are better, and making them more like real neural nets isn't the point. They're already better than us. They're a better way of doing learning. And if we make them bigger, they'll get much smarter than us. They already know more than any one person.
I understand that things could go awry, but I still think that people hear the notion of danger and they dismiss it as hyperbole.
I thought it was hyperbole for a long time because I thought these things were a long way off. I thought there will eventually be danger, but I thought focusing on it now is unnecessary because it'll be 30 to 50 years before these things get more intelligent than us. But this combination of realizing that they might have a much better way of learning than we have because they can share knowledge instantly, and seeing things like ChatGPT or Palm at Google that can explain why a joke is funny made me realize these things are already pretty intelligent. And if they've got a better form of intelligence than ours, then it gets to be much more urgent.
So, I mean, I think this is hugely significant. There is actually an article today that I published in an interview with me on Archinect, where I'm kind of talking about these things. This is the issue that we need to be concerned about as architects. We're all obsessed by mid-journey. But what Geoffrey Hinton's talking about is say, it's not mid-journey. It's not one of these kind of these applications that is based on the logic of these large language models, but the large language models themselves that are so scary and frightening because they're so capable. It's not as though they can be dangerous. They can't have an evil thought unless you think they can think, and this is the question I think that Geoffrey Hinton is beginning to address. But they are dangerous. They are terrifying because they are so capable. Now, but what does he mean when he says thought? Is he being like Blake Lamoine? Is he ascribing some kind of sentience to AI, or what exactly? And how is he justifying that? How do I know if you're sentient even? We don't know this. So it's in a kind of murky zone, but I would just say, pay attention to Geoffrey Hinton. And if this person, one of the smartest people working in AI in the world, is concerned about it, and if he begins to think that they can think, then we may soon be in a situation where they'll develop a form of consciousness. Now, just to be clear, that, as he puts it, they are more intelligent than us, but they don't have the same kind of form of intelligence. Does that mean they have a different form of sentience or a different form of creativity and so on? I want to move on finally to the question of creativity itself. I mean, one of the things I want to ask about creativity is really the question of what AI can tell us about creativity. Now, this is a famous moment. Many of you in China know about it. This match, AlphaGo against Lisa Doll, in the history of Go was a seminal moment because nobody expected Lisa Doll to lose to AI. And this is deep learning. So in other words, what Geoffrey Hinton had developed was eventually, and it came to fruition around 2006, as soon as we got more powerful and faster computers, that was deployed in this game because you couldn't train Go to play based on previous matches because there are there are more moves in Go than there are atoms in the universe. Even if you put all the computers in the world together, you wouldn't be able to deal with it. So you needed these learning systems. In other words, the neural networks, the powerful neural networks that have been developed that are behind the large language models to be used in this game of Go. Well, what was interesting about this game, nobody expected that he was going to lose, nobody at all, least of all. But he makes this comment, yesterday I was surprised, and this is after game 2, but today I am speechless, again after game 2. And the reason for that was a particular move that's now become famous in the game of Go, move 37 in game 2, where it put this black stone unusually on the 5th line as opposed to the 4th or the 3rd line, as you normally do in the beginning of a game. And nobody understood it. They all thought it was a computer glitch, and yet 100 moves later, these two stones connected up and it won the game. It was almost as though it was thinking 100 moves ahead. But the point being, we couldn't even understand this because it was playing beyond our level. Just as a dog has greater hearing or smell than human beings, so AI is smarter, and we need to realize that. It's able to do things that we can't do. So this is actually a comment by the commentators at the time. Let me see if I can play this.
From the Google team was talking about this kind of evaluation, value.
That's a very surprising move.
I thought it was a mistake.
He thought it was a mistake. It wasn't a mistake. But what was interesting is the way that was interpreted, and I'm not going to read through these things, but you can see these comments about creativity and beauty. Interesting. I mean, if beauty is in the mind of the beholder, is creativity in the mind of the beholder? Everybody thought it was creative. And I think this is the interesting kind of question we're faced with here. AlphaGo showed us that moves that humans may have thought are creative were actually conventional. In other words, we think it's creative, but is it? My view personally would be this is a machine performing very efficiently. It is working out the most efficient move, but we think it's creative. We think it's creative, but it's not. I don't think it's creative. I don't think you can talk about a machine being creative. You can talk about a machine being efficient and so on. I do not believe that AlphaGo was being creative. I know others disagree with me on that. I know Memo Acton thinks that machines can be creative, but I question that. We end up in an interesting situation here. Margaret Bowden makes this comment, which I think is very true. There is nothing magical about creativity. I'm not quite sure why she says that, but I would agree with her. I would also argue that magic itself doesn't exist. This is somebody showing how you do the disappearing coin trick. When a magician does a trick, that magician is not actually performing magic. What that magician is doing is concealing the actual operations, at work, so as to fool the audience into attributing them to magic. And the same, in some senses, goes for technology. When technology works and we don't know how it works, we just believe in it, but we don't understand how it actually works. In other words, creativity, magic, and technology are quite astonishing. Let me show you this video and a comment by Arthur C. Clarke. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Now, Arthur C. Clarke, I quoted him in the very first session. He was a British futurist who predicted that AI would be what it is today, and he's come up with many important sort of comments. What we're seeing here is Bot and Dolly, a company based in San Francisco that basically are using robots and performing illusions. These actually are just, they look like the three-dimensional forms, but actually it's a bunch of tricks. It's a bunch of tricks that give the impression that what we're seeing is something else. But in the end, it's simply technology. And what another comment from Arthur C. Clarke is to say that is that anything we don't quite understand is basically science that we haven't understood yet, and we call it magic. So we get a connection between creativity, magic, and technology that is super fascinating. Here I want to sort of conclude in a way by asking a series of, making a series of points. So according to Margaret Bowden, there is nothing magical about creativity. According to me and many other people, there is also nothing magical about magic. It's just a trick. It's not actually magic. Nothing is magic. And thirdly, there is nothing magical about technology in a sense from Arthur C. Clarke. In other words, if there's nothing, and then they say, then could we move to the step based on these comments that there's nothing creative about technology? I would say so too. Then the final question then, is there anything creative about creativity? I mean, that's a very provocative comment, but let's go back to this Chinese room experiment and just think about what is being argued here. So on the outside, as I mentioned before, here are these two Chinese people who think that somebody on the inside is performing a fluent Chinese speaker and who's producing these texts. Actually, what's happening is simply information processing. Could we not say the same, certainly about AlphaGo, and possibly about human beings? In other words, AlphaGo might appear to the outside to be being creative, but actually what it's doing is just very efficiently performing certain operations like a machine does. But by extension, and this is where I'm being extremely provocative, by extension, couldn't we also say the same about human creativity? Is creativity a term that we use to describe that which we don't understand? If magic is used to describe basically science we don't understand, could we not say that creativity is being used to understand, to perform human processes that we don't understand? And indeed, could we even take the view that in the end that really our problem is we're not as good as computers. We're not as good as AI. AI is more efficient in processing that information than we are. And all we're doing when we think we're being creative is processing information, but because of our inadequacies, and it's exactly the point that Jeff Hinton makes, we are not as good as AI. And that's why in my work I call for this notion of the second Copernican revolution. Just as Nicholas Copernicus had said that the Earth is not the center of the universe, so I think we need to recognize that we are not the center of intelligent life on the universe. So going back to the very comment at the very beginning by Hiroshi Ishii, the robot is a kind of mirror that reflects humanity. And by creating intelligent robots, we can open up new opportunities to contemplate what it means to be human. Well, first of all, the notion of the mirror has been central to what we've been talking about today, both the mirror stage and Narcissus and so on. It's central to the notion of psychoanalysis, and therefore it's relevant in some ways. But this idea that in the mirror of AI, we can begin to understand what it is to be human, I think that is the most important promise, in a sense, of what AI can give us. I've long believed that really the most important contribution of computation is to help us understand how the human mind works. And refer back to the famous moment when Craig Reynolds was trying to simulate the flocking behaviors of birds. And he produced this script where he had these things called boids. And very convincingly, he managed to simulate how birds flock. And as a result of that, the bird specialists began to realize that was how birds flock, and they didn't know before. To my mind, then, the promise of AI is something similar. So this talk then, and I just want to mention that again that I've referred to many of these things in this interview that came out on Archinect today. It's kind of pointing towards something that is really, in some ways, quite startling. It's kind of, in a sense, I'm amplifying what Geoffrey Hinton has been saying. We need to pay attention to these large language models and what they're doing. But importantly, and I don't think this has been processed yet, we also need to think about whether even the term thought needs to be reconsidered. If machines can think, albeit maybe not thinking in the same way as human beings, if machines are intelligent, albeit maybe not intelligent as human beings, but maybe much more intelligent, then we need to kind of reflect on precisely how we're going to think about the role of humans. The role of humans as, which up until now, the one that we've held as being the most intelligent species on the universe, the one that thinks the most, the one that is most creative. But above all, we need to recognize our own limitations in the context of an entity that is out there, that is challenging us and calling us into question, exposing our own limitations. And above all, to my mind, it affects the world of theory, because what else is theory than critical thinking? Are the critical thinkers of the future going to be AI? Are the critical theorists of the future going to be AI-based? I don't know the answer to that, but it seems to me we are living in such an important moment in terms of the evolution of the species. And from that point of view, I would even go further than Geoffrey Hinton. Geoffrey Hinton was saying you can compare this moment to the invention of the wheel, or the invention of fire, or the invention of electricity, all these things. I think we need to go beyond that. These are just tools, mechanisms that we invented. But what's happening right now is the fundamental condition of the human being is being called into question. As we recognize for the first time, there may be some entity out there that far surpasses us. And that's going to affect the world of architecture more than anything else. And I would simply refer you to the article, maybe it can be put in the chat, about that came out today. We need to pay attention to this. We mustn't just be caught up in the world of Midjourney, interesting as these images are. And this is an image of Midjourney. And if you want to go and find out more, just go into Instagram and you can find me under Neil Leach 14. Like many other people, we're producing these things and they are simply astonishing. But these are just glimpses of the potential of what AI is going to do in the future. Clearly, we're going to go beyond images. We're going to go far beyond images. But AI is speeding up, and it won't be very much long before everybody begins to realize, maybe too late, that we need to pay attention to these things. So I'm going to stop at this point here and open up to questions. I want to just apologize for the problems I had with this presentation. I think it's to do with my own laptop, but anyway, so let's leave it there. If you've got any questions, please put it into the questions and answers. I see that Gustavo's put it into the chat, the Archinect thing. Yeah, so anyway, I hope that was a provocative kind of comment that will at least cause you to think about our condition. Yeah. So do we have any questions? No questions on YouTube. Okay. Do we have any questions from the group here? Okay, so there is a question in the Q&A. If the building can be reused, the form of the building can be recycled. In the digital future, like the current AI images, buildings will be conveniently created in some form. I wonder what you think about this. If the building can be reused, the form of the building can be recycled. In the digital future, like the current AI images, buildings will be conveniently created by the public in some form. Well, I'm not sure what exactly you're referring to here or alluding to here, but what I would say is that in fact, I maybe should have mentioned this in the context of interactive design. I think what we discovered during the pandemic was, well, the pandemic, I think, kind of jolted us out of our familiar routines. We developed new techniques, new strategies to survive, and so on. And it forced, or at least opened up the opportunity, or made us aware of the opportunity that we actually could operate in a different way. I'm actually based on Venice Beach, but I teach in 3 different continents. I don't teach in this particular city, but I do it online. And there are many opportunities for doing it online, and we know about these things. We know about the possibility the digital futures has exploited. But so too, it also affects the physical space. In other words, the space in which I'm operating right now is, as it were, my office, but this evening is going to become the dining room, and also could become a space for social interaction. It could be many other things. In other words, I personally think that the future of architecture is going to be largely confined to adaptive reuse of existing buildings. And I agree with you. I think we're going to get interior design is going to be really important in terms of remodeling the interior of existing buildings. I don't think that many buildings will be demolished for various reasons. I mean, mainly economic, but also to do with kind of building codes and so on. We will probably retain our buildings, but what we will have is buildings that are retrofitted, as I mentioned in the previous session, with AI technology. Not just AI technology in a sense that will kind of control the heating system and make our buildings more environmentally sustainable. Not just the use of things like the Nest thermostat, but also other forms of design, such as interactive design. I can see that responsive spaces, interactive spaces, are going to be crucial in the way that we operate in the future. So I completely agree that that recycling is going to be the future. I'm not so sure how much building will be done in the future. Especially as the population growth is slowing down. And in fact, some people, such as Elon Musk, thinks the problem. I think our problem is not the growth of the population, but the shrinkage. In other words, once you get into exponential shrinkage, it becomes a problem. And in places like China, for example, it's interesting where there was the one child, one family regulation that was brought in. But to what extent can that new generation that has been brought up with that kind of logic, to what extent can that then go back into the large family scenario we had in the past? Increasingly, we're seeing this in Japan, especially the pressures of work where people are obliged to put off having a family and maybe even abandon having a family, are leading to a scenario where there's shrinkage, enormous shrinkage in a population, unless you have each family having 2 kids each, and in fact, everyone being part of a family and having 2 kids. Unless you have that, you are not going to maintain your population. And if someone is not getting married, or if a couple's only having 1 kid, it's going to get catastrophic in terms of the collapse. And there are knock-on effects in terms of the economy, where you don't have as much of a workforce to support the retired age. And already in Japan, the age of the population is going up and up. So I think I would agree that question. There's another question here from Liu Hui. Can we say AI is more intelligent than humans to some degree? So AI is more creative than humans to some degree. Well, I mean, I in these situations, I pay attention to the people who know, to Jeff Hinton and others. I also buy into the comments that Yuval Harari was making about whether we need consciousness. And I strongly think that as long as a machine does its job, In other words, if you've got a toaster, as long as it toasts bread, you don't care if it's conscious, as long as it can do what it's going to do. And of course, in any case, at the moment, at least, when we have humans in the loop, there is consciousness because it's humans using AI. Therefore, there's consciousness in the loop. So I think that, frankly, that AI, you don't need consciousness at all. I agree that it could be a hindrance. So first of all, I think the myth that we've been living under, that somehow AI is inferior because it's not conscious. I mean, there are many theories about, many comments for Anil Seth said, well, do we need that as well? I don't think we need it. So first of all, I don't think intelligence should be understood in that way. And I agree with Jeffrey Hinton, there's other forms of intelligence, absolutely other forms of intelligence that are different and that are way more powerful. And I absolutely agree with his comments about how the problem is these computers are learning instantaneously from each other. Absolutely. So I definitely agree that. But I mean, in terms of creativity, let me just go. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but my theory of what's happening with Midjourney. I mean, these images that I'm showing you right now are Midjourney images. And just to go back to the model of the GAN, I might have mentioned this, I'm sorry if I did, but the GAN, the Generative Adversarial Network, is based on these two neural networks competing against each other. One is a generator, which is churning out images, just churning them out. And one is a discriminator that's kind of saying, it's judging these images and saying, that's not good enough, that's not good enough, that's not good enough, and so on, which is forcing the generator to improve the quality of the images that it's been improving. Now, that's interesting as a model because it talks about how we operate in the world of architecture. In other words, creative people need to have some critical feedback to improve their work, but critical people need to have some creative feedback to make their theories more acceptable and more meaningful in some ways. You can think of someone like Rainer Banham, who's a very, very creative theorist. So those two work together. Now, when we're dealing with Midjourney, with Dali, we're not talking about the GAN operation. It's a diffusion model. What happens with the diffusion model is basically you're using Gaussian noise that comes out of a Markov chain logic, which is actually the same logic that was used by Benas Faraina in her project with the mask. And that is simply kind of disrupting images. And in the process of preparing them, this is how it generates new images. So it's not operating in a completely different way of operating. But what I would claim is that we can still take that model of the GAN, and we, in a sense, are the discriminators. We are the discriminators, and we are very, I did mention this, so I'll mention it again. We are the ones who are very good at immediately judging things, like perfume. You smell a perfume, immediately we know if you like it or not. We can taste a cocktail, the same thing, But we're not so good as generators. So I think that what's happening is our weakness in terms of conceiving of possibilities. We tend to think about 6 things at once, right? That's it. But our weakness is we can't think more than that, beyond that range. But so what we get is basically AI is enhancing us. It's enhancing that aspect of, as it were, creativity, in the sense it's enhancing the generation or the number of options that we can call upon. And then we're using our skills as a discriminator, as a critic, to select the images out and to go with those things. And I think that's a very useful model to think about. So I think so to answer your question, is AI more creative than humans to some degree? First of all, I don't think either are being creative. That's my provocative line. I think that's a huge provocation. I'm following the work of Claude Shannon, who argued that it's all about information processes, and also, frankly, Philippe Morel, who's teaching at the Bartlett. He's one of the candidates on the FIU DDES, where I teach, which I direct. He takes the same view. So I don't think that it's being creative. But for sure, whatever we call this process, whether we call it creative or what, successful generation of images, shall we say, then I think it's enhancing that one particular aspect of it. But that's a good question. Okay, there's a question here from Gustavo. Is it your question, Gustavo, or not? Okay. Anyway, how do you see the role of technology? AI that can evolve humanity beyond controlling our conventional understanding of the computer, and for it to be integrated directly biologically into a cellular level? Can we say that our understanding of the cybernetic is limited, a human-computer hybridity? Does a philosophy exist that names humanity's next phase of evolution? What kind of timeline do our current scientific communities predict that AI become autonomous and sentient? Well, maybe I can start with the final questions. I think that's really interesting. The question of timeline. I mean, partly because there was a book, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but Martin Ford produced this book where he asked people about when this would happen. And nobody could even agree on the processes or the stages. They all reinterpreted it in their own particular way, but they certainly couldn't agree on dates. And I mentioned, I'm blanking his name now, the Rodney Brooks in this lecture today. Rodney Brooks said it won't be before 2099. Everybody, in a sense, was thinking it was going to be much later. Even Jeff Hinton himself, and now we're realizing actually it's happening right now, and it's going faster than we thought. And all these predictions by Ray Kurzweil about what we call the singularity. The singularity for Ray Kurzweil is this idea, this explosion of knowledge, where suddenly things go completely exponential, and just the universe becomes this absolute explosion of knowledge, which is a kind of, I don't know, metaphorical concept or something, and some don't believe in it. I know that Blaise Agridiakos doesn't believe in it. But if it does exist, then possibly we're approaching the singularity right now, way before anybody thought it was going to happen. We are at a moment when things are exploding in some way anyway. So, yeah. Then the previous one, does a philosophy exist that names humanity's next phase of evolution? That's a good phase. Actually, there's Ross Lovegrove, who is the most exquisite industrial designer. He's the king of industrial design. Ross is unbelievable. We had him in Venice for our session on AI, and we had him online for Digital Futures. And Ross is speculating there's a, how did he put it? An AI city or something like that. We've had an AI scene. We had the Anthropocene, and then we got the AI scene. So I don't know what's happening in philosophy. I know that Yukui is trying to address some of these questions, and maybe, but I like the idea of an AI scene for sure. Let's go back in terms of the question. A question: how do you see the role of technology, AI, that can evolve humanity beyond controlling our conventional understanding of the computer, and for it to be integrated directly, biologically, in a cellular level? Well, let me simply say that there is, of course, a company that is called Neuralink that Elon Musk is part of, and people haven't been paying attention to this. Well, they have and they haven't. Neuralink is, in a sense, interfacing with the brain. There's a chip that eventually is going to go into it. The big question, and actually some of the demonstrations are just astonishing. There, if you go online, you can see there's a monkey playing what's the Pong? Is it the game where you have these two little, I don't know, it's a computer game. I think it's called Pong, and it's playing with its mind. It's kind of interesting because they tapped into the signals of the brain and began to sort of hack into them to understand them, and then they effectively went straight to the computer screen. And although this monkey is using a kind of a joystick or something, or some kind of device to control, or at least thinks that he's using or she's using it, actually it's going straight from the brain, and that is fascinating. The controversy is that on the one hand, Elon Musk said this would be great because this could allow people like Stephen Hawking. And just as an aside, I bought my house in Cambridge from Stephen Hawking, so he's somebody I kind of know quite well. That someone like Stephen Hawking can be made more mobile, or Marcus Kay, the amazing AI artist, who has a similar kind of neuronal dysfunction and can't get out of bed. It could help those people in improvement, allow them to walk and so on. At the same time, Slavoj Žižek is worried that it can also enable someone to control our minds. Is that possible? I'm not quite sure whether it is. can we say that our understanding of the cybernetic is limited a human-computer hybridity? That's an interesting question. I mean, cybernetics refers to humans and machines. And that's what many people criticize it for. But could it be its possibility? I don't know the answer, but that's a good question. So let's go down. We got I got two questions from Vasco. Can camouflage be seen as a metaphor for the fragility and impermanence of life, where the boundary between existence and non-existence blurs? The second question, with the increasing integration of technology in our daily lives, can virtual spaces become sites for mourning, remembrance, or even the creation of digital legacies? Well, I mean, just to answer the second question first, they already do. I don't know if you know about this, but I certainly have someone that I knew here in Venice Beach in California who died, and there's an on-site thing where you put your thoughts and things, and it's quite dynamic. People are always adding things to it, and then you I mean, I think the thing about this the world of computation is it becomes an amazing social platform, or a platform for social interaction, as we're seeing here right now. So absolutely. But what is interesting also is the idea, and this is a prediction that's made by I'm just thinking of his name now, Machines That Think. He's a British guy working in Australia, Toby Walsh. And he makes the prediction we'll live on after our deaths. We will live on after our deaths because we can model ourselves. we can record ourselves. And I don't know if you've seen this, but Michel Rofkin, I mean, the first session we had on AI from this last series, he had an avatar of himself that was kind of convincing, but it's going to get more convincing, right? I mean, it's going to be so realistic in some ways. And so he was able to model himself as an avatar, and we're going to get that even after we've died. We can already design Zaha buildings after she's died in some senses by locking into this logic, but we will actually get personalities. You can record what people are like, you can record their voice, their physiognomy, and so on, but also you can record their behavior, and there's so much data out there, what we choose, what we do, whatever, that is all being recorded. It is already, right? And that's why we're being fed a certain amount of certain news by the news channels, because it knows what we want. And likewise, we're getting products recommended for us because it also knows what products we want, and so on and so on. So clearly at some point, we're going to have AI that's going to be so much like us, can model us and simulate us to the point that actually, that even after we're dead, we will continue on living. So I certainly think that. So can camouflage be seen as a metaphor for the fragility and impermanence of life, where the boundary between existence and non-existence blurs? Yeah, I don't know. I see, I mean, for sure, life is delicate. We know this. I mean, we don't know if we're going to be around tomorrow. None of us does. We don't know at all. So life is fragile. And that's why I always think, and I have this, there's a motto in Latin, carpe diem, seize the opportunity, never put something off, do it now, for sure. So, you know, I think life is impermanent, is not that. But I think camouflage is more, let's say, a strategy for survival. And that relates back to the literal use of camouflage on a battlefield. And of course, not just the camouflage, but also the night sights and so on that allow you to see what you otherwise couldn't see. That is also part of a logic of camouflage. Now, what I find interesting about it is that two things. It's one that it's visual and it's about survival. That's one thing. And I think this is where the chameleon is interesting as a creature, because we are so similar to the chameleon. We privilege the visual. We are creatures of fashion. That's what we are. We are ocular-centric creatures of fashion, and it therefore kind of rings true with us. But the second thing is the point I made, I think, yesterday, how we can see the strategies of this theory of camouflage as a way of trying to map ourselves into a world that's become completely homogeneous, where everything's become the same in the world of the generic city. How do we map ourselves? And this goes back to Frederick Jameson, who's concerned about this possibility of losing a sense of where we are. What he seems to be saying is what we need is a viable form of aesthetic expression that reinserts us in society. In other words, what camouflage is ultimately about is not prescribing a certain kind of style of architecture or anything. It's about prescribing a certain sensibility towards design that allows the human to reconnect with the world around them. In other words, it's about a kind of sensuous correspondence and about design, the importance of design in making that happen. If you think about something like a motorbike, you can get these kind of really old-fashioned, rather ugly motorbikes, and now they're these sleek machines and things. I think all forms of technology are not just about function, but about how they look, to go back to that kind of dialectical discussion that Adolf Loos was talking about. So absolutely, I think that's the case. So it's not about the fragility so much as a strategy or a tactic to survive, for sure, and to survive from a kind of emotional point of view. So maybe the next phase of evolution is to be completely data beings integrated into a larger simulation. This is a question also in the chat, and maybe. Who knows? I mean, I think I made this comment before, is you can develop a tool and you know what that tool's for. The iPhone was supposedly for business people, right? But actually, it's the way people use it and take it further. And I don't know what's going to happen, but I could see that, yes, we could be data beings. I could see that. So there's another one, an anonymous attendee. It's like the story of Narcissus. Mirror, we will project ourselves on AI, is also like the interaction between architecture and people, which is a kind of vitality. If AI looks at the mirror, what will it project, and what does it want to produce? The interaction between life and death, in contrast, is it also animated? Just like Zhuangzhu Mengdi. I don't know Zhuangzhu Mengdi, but I'm intrigued to find out who that person is. Well, I mean, just to clarify, AI doesn't project. Humans project. That's what we do. You know, we project life onto our cars, or names onto our cars, personalities onto our cars. We project meaning onto the universe. The universe, frankly, is just a kind of, you know, I think Brownian motion. It's accidental. There's no order in the universe. It's just simply, well, I don't think so anyway. It's just kind of, it's evolved in a certain sort of way, but we're the ones who project meaning onto the thing. We're the ones who kind of read God into these things and so on. So we are the meaning-making machines that do that. AI doesn't do that. AI just works with patterns and tries to discern the patterns. There's no logic of projection, at least up until now. Now, I haven't thought about this in the context of what Jeffrey Hinton's saying about where if you start thinking, then you start sort of coming up with some kind of projection. I somehow doubt it. I think it's one of the most, I don't know, I've got to be careful what I say about religion, but I mean religion ultimately is kind of bizarre. I mean, you can understand why it existed in antiquity. You would need to explain natural phenomenon, and it was developed in some senses for that. But why people still partake of religion now is more of a mystery to me, especially in the States, where this kind of fundamentalism is absolutely written into everything and has a very, very dangerous edge to it. So I don't know a religion. I don't think we escape religion, by the way. I don't think that ever we escape religion, or rather, let's say religiosity, because when you displace religion, you get other forms of religiosity that kind of creep in, whether it's kind of recycling glass or whatever it is. That's kind of a belief system. And the point has been made, actually, in terms of Richard Dawkins, who's a scientist who's so critical of the concept of God. They say, well, hold on a second, isn't science also a belief system? And it is. It is a belief system in some senses. So I don't think we ever get beyond belief. When I'm saying that is what I believe. I say I don't think that's me making a statement of belief. So we'll never get beyond belief. We'll never get beyond religiosity. The danger is, I think, when some of these things get out of control. When you get in Trumpism, you get this kind of uncritical belief in what is a fiction. I mean, that is problematic. Or indeed, when you get countries fighting against each other, and that happens all over the world, we see it again and again because of religion. You know, I don't think religion was made for that and it was intended that way, but there are dark sides to that. I'm probably talking nonsense now and getting carried away, so maybe we should. Are there any final questions? Just to say, I mentioned yesterday, if you want to find the Camouflage book, you can find it online. I put it up on my website, but I can't control my website anymore because I've lost the password and don't use the right email address and so on. But it's there. There's and also anesthetics, I think I put up there as well. But feel free to check that out. Okay, so if there are no final questions, Gustavo, can you see any final questions on the chat, on either chat or in the YouTube chat? Okay, so let me just say
no final questions, Neil.
Okay, just apologize. I don't know what happened with my computer today. I'm sorry for the late start, but it was no point in giving a presentation without images, so I had to restart. So my apologies. Okay, so tomorrow we're looking at the theme of melancholia and also drawing upon camouflage. There is a chapter in Camouflage on melancholia if you want to read up in advance. So, okay, so let's leave it at that. I hope that was provocative. I hope that gave you some ideas and some thoughts and things. And yeah, and my apologies again for the delay at the beginning because of the images. Okay, so there's one in the chat. Oh, thank you. Great. Thanks a lot, everyone. See you tomorrow. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye-bye.